Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, February the 16th, 2025. A couple of years ago, we did a show with my old friend Frank Vogl on the global fight against corruption. He was the author of The Enablers, How the West Supports Kleptocrats and Corruption, Endangering Our Democracy. He's also the co-founder of Transparency International, a nonprofit focused on exposing financial corruption. And then last year, we had Frank back on the show to ask whether Donald Trump 2.0, and this was in just after the election, will be what we called a semi-legal repeat of the Sam Bankman-Fried FTX debacle. We are now almost 2 months into the Trump regime, and I thought we might revisit this question with Frank Vogl. So, Frank, will we exaggerating the fears? You have an interesting new piece out in The Globalist, Trump-style U.S. financial deregulation and its global ramifications. Is it as bad as we thought, as we feared?
Yes. It's good to be with you, Andrew. Thank you for having me. Yes, we are really in danger, I think, of developments that could lead to a financial crisis, maybe in a few years' time, even worse than the 2008 financial crisis. And if you remember, that led to massive unemployment, massive economic hardship, not just in the US, but across the world. And it was caused by wild speculation, greed, and mismanagement by basically maybe less than 24 private financial institutions, quite a number of which were bailed out. We are now on the road, thanks to what Trump and his friend Elon Musk are doing. We are well on the road to setting the basis for a new era of financial deregulation with all the risks that involves.
Yeah, it's chilling. You know your stuff, Frank. I wonder, in historical terms, some people have made a lot of Trump's interest. One wonders how seriously interested he is in the presidency of McKinley and colonialism in Latin America. America is great and all that stuff. But I wonder whether we really are returning to the 1920s and the unconstrained speculative capitalism in the age of Coolidge and Harding and the other Republicans of the 1920s of Hoover. Are there historical analogies here? I mean, you're not a historian, but it was, of course, the teapot scandal and so much else of the unregulated capitalism of the 20s that resulted in the Great Crash.
Yes, that's true. But what we also need to remember is that it led to a new era of regulation. The establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the establishment later of other regulatory bodies, the focus on ensuring that financial institutions did not have excessive power. And what we're now facing is indeed not only the prospect of excessive power by financial institutions, but a much more complicated array of financial institutions, as, for example, Elon Musk unquestionably wants to enter the financial arena, operating his own quasi-bank. And we can get into more details of that.
And he's always been clear about that. He's always said that for him, X ultimately is a bank, or amongst other things, it will be a bank.
What we're seeing now, and I think here, we're not only seeing the possibility of a new era of deregulation for the banks themselves, and I think your parallels with an earlier era are quite appropriate. But in addition to that, we are seeing the possibility of a whole new unregulated system of finance coming out of essentially Silicon Valley. And in addition to that, we have the complete mayhem gambling, greed, corruption, money laundering associated with crypto tokens. So put all of that together, and you have got what I think is a very dangerous situation that could affect the global economy as a whole.
In other words, maybe we are going back to Sam Bankman-Fried and the FTX debacle. Some people, Frank and Keith Tier, might argue this. He was on the show yesterday. He's a friend of mine from Silicon Valley, an entrepreneur, would say that you're overreacting, that the previous administration, the Biden administration, particularly in figures like Lena Khan, was stifling innovation. And all the Trump people are doing are letting innovators innovate. Musk, of course, is a particularly good example of that. How would you respond to that argument? Is there any truth in
it? I don't think so when it comes to finance. I don't think so. And let me try and backtrack just a little bit. Our government essentially has two components: the administrative state, where we have all these government departments that monitor, that put into place government programs, projects, and so on, and the regulatory state, where we have all these agencies to fundamentally protect American citizens, whether it's in health or consumer product safety, and of course in finance. And what we have to keep in mind in answer to your question is that first and foremost, we need a safe and sound financial system. Everybody benefits from that. And in that respect, I would argue we are cautious enough right now. Let's not demolish this. We have a very healthy financial system right now. Just look at the stock market. We have a healthy financial system. It could be improved. There are at the margin lots of things we could do, but let's not, and I'm particularly talking about the banks, let's not allow the greed of the bankers once more and their corruption once more to drag us all down into a massive, great recession. And let me just point out, if I may, the profits of the biggest banks in 2024 were an absolute record. Jamie Dimon, the head of the biggest of those banks, JP Morgan Chase, took home a record $39 million in compensation. The head of Goldman Sachs got an $80 million bonus.
Which actually, in Silicon Valley terms, Frank, is not that much money. I mean, certainly when you compare it to the Musks and the Thiels and, and the others of this world. So 30, 40, $80 million is probably disappointing from a Silicon Valley point of view. But anyway, go on.
Well, my point only is the banks and our financial system is still the bedrock, the center, the core of safety and soundness in our financial system are the banks. And the people at the top of the banks are getting better compensated than they ever have before. What are they campaigning for? What are they supporting Trump on? What are they arguing for right now? Is the kind of deregulation that Paul Volcker, the former late president of the Federal Reserve Board, warned would be dangerous for our...
Frank, let's get into that.
Yeah.
My understanding of the 2008 crash was that the banks took advantage of innocent, vulnerable, perhaps stupid consumers and lent them money that they shouldn't have had the right to borrow, which created the subprime mortgage crisis that crashed the economy. What do bankers want to do in 2025 that, in your view, they shouldn't be allowed to do?
Well, you're right about describing what happened, but at the same time, quite a number of financial institutions back then borrowed enormous sums. They leveraged their basic resources in order to speculate on all manner of very complicated derivative financial instruments. They were essentially gambling. A man called Prince, who ran Citigroup, said, well, we have to keep dancing so long as the music is on.
But capitalism is about dancing, Frank. It's about taking risk, isn't it?
It may be to some degree, But when you have an institution like JP Morgan Chase with over $4 trillion in assets, you have to think very hard about what its mission should be. And its mission fundamentally is to serve its customers, not to serve the top people there alone. Let them get rich at the top, but let them be prudent, let them have integrity, let them serve their customers. If we forget that, then I think we are in deep trouble financially. And I think, unfortunately, that Trump and Musk have no time for that sort of thing. Let me just give you one simple example. The other day, Trump suddenly said, we are no longer going to investigate international and corporate corruption. And he put the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act on pause.
Yeah, that was February 10, and I'm quoting from whitehouse.gov, pausing Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement to further American economic and national security, whatever that means.
Yeah, well, the act was signed by Jimmy Carter in 1977. The largest single fines ever paid for criminal activity and foreign bribery were by Goldman Sachs, a bank. Now it paid total globally close to $4 billion in fines, to $1.6 billion just to the US. Now, what are we going to do? We're ending investigations of exactly the kind of activity that made Goldman Sachs at the time very profitable. We are ending all manner of investigative fraud in all manner of finance. For example, give you another one last week, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, CFPB, has essentially been shuttered. A judge on Friday night said that it should continue in business, but the way in which it's going to continue under basically the efforts by Trump's own people, and Trump has put his own people into the CFPB, is to ensure that it has minimal resources to investigate. What does it investigate? It investigates banks that have committed fraud against their regular customers. Just recall what Wells Fargo did. It was caught by the CFPB and it paid major fines. Many of Wells Fargo customers were unfortunately subject to that fraud.
But how does that all add up, Frank? I take your point, and it's a Sunday, so your moralizing is appropriate. But how does that all end? How does that add up to a financial crisis? I take the fact that the CFPB is troubling. Much else is troubling. But why should this cause the whole system to collapse?
Okay, let's go back a second and look at this in three different components, as I said: banks, digital finance, and crypto. Let's start with the banks. The banks are lobbying very hard right now for reduced so-called capital requirements. That means that they have to have less money in their reserve in case there's a crisis. They want to have lower capital requirements so they can use more of their money. They want less regulation of how they use their money so that they can basically speculate on their own account. Why? Because the profits of banks, the short-term profits of banks, are incredibly important as determining the compensation of the bankers themselves. Their bonuses are tied to those short-term profits.
So I take your point. So
they
let me just read into this. So what you're saying is that if banks are allowed to gamble so aggressively, I mean, that's great if they win, but if they lose, of course, we all lose. Is that the argument? And then we have to bail them out again.
That's part of the argument. The other thing is that as some banks lose, they may get merged into other banks to the point where you have just a small number of absolutely huge banks that can never fail. If they were to fail, our economy would fail. So the moral hazard here is the banks know that when they take huge risks, they will be bailed out. Uh, and that's something we dare never forget when we're talking about the way in which our economy is subject to real dangers if we loosen the regulation on banks and we loosen at the same time all the systems that are in place to investigate fraud and corruption in banks. But then, on top of that, you now have all these quasi banking systems coming out of Silicon Valley: PayPal, Venmo, Apple Pay, and you mentioned earlier X Finance. X recently announced that it had done a deal with Visa on payment systems, and that this is just the first step to creating the X financial
But Frank,
systems.
you're sounding a little, I don't know, reactionary, maybe alarmist. I mean, what's wrong with PayPal? I mean, none of the
There
founders
is
of
nothing.
PayPal, the Teals and the Musks, are no longer around. It's simply a digital system to allow people to buy stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's great the way it is today. But let's say it's these entities are also allowed to take deposits and make loans and do a whole slew of operations exactly like banks. Do it all online. And who is regulating that? Where is the safety and soundness?
But where's the evidence? Certainly, in these first few weeks of the Trump regime, that they are going to allow PayPal or X or Apple Pay to become banks without the traditional regulations of banks. And from a traditional banking point of view, of course, I would assume that the Jamie Dimons of the world would actually fight this because it undermines them.
Yeah, sure. But we're seeing an administration in place that's tearing the system apart. Look at each of the regulatory agencies. Look how each one of them has had both new people put in by Trump to take charge of those agencies, people with long histories of being against all kinds of regulation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation just lost 500 staff last week because of the so-called voluntary resignations. When you cut down the amount of regulatory enforcement and the amount of investigation by all these very important agencies, you are basically opening the door to all manner of abuse. And I'm sorry to say, history shows that when there's the opportunity for abuse, then there is abuse. And yes, it's Sunday. And yes, this may sound like moralizing, but I really hope that your optimism and confidence in Silicon Valley's ability to manage complicated finance is justified. I'm skeptical.
So you're saying that Apple or X or PayPal shouldn't be able to be banks? I mean, if they had the traditional regulations of the banking industry, what's wrong with that?
Nothing. Who's going to do it? Who will be the regulator? Do you see Trump proposing to Congress that a brand new regulatory agency be established for this kind of finance? Come on, that's not the way the Trump team think. Just look at crypto.
Yeah, well, let's look at crypto because crypto seems a little more concrete. Melania Trump launched her own cryptocurrency. It's an enormous speculative bubble. I mean, it is the tulip speculation all over again because there's nothing behind it. Last week or late in January, both Donald and Melania Trump's crypto tokens plummeted. They go up and down radically. Someone's profiting, someone's losing. How important is this, Frank, in terms of the broader economy? Is this just another sideshow or just another way that the Trump family gets rich and we all lose?
I hope it is contained. at the moment, we shouldn't exaggerate, the whole crypto token business is still perhaps $3 to $4 trillion in size. This is very small in terms of global finance. But it worries me that we could see an administration, for very strong reasons of self-interest and conflict of interest situations arising, doing something to develop this kind of financial rapid gambling and speculation. And by the way, most of the people who are invested in crypto, just like most of the people who are using PayPal and Venmo and all these things, are relatively young people. Ages, according to some statistics, between about 18 and 35. Many of them do not have the experience of past financial crises. Many of them do not have the knowledge.
Frank, we've got to be clear. There's a big difference between using PayPal to buy something online,
of course,
and investing in crypto. One is entirely speculative. One is just a way of a financial transaction.
Do you really think that? Just take Elon Musk. Do you really think X Financial is going to be satisfied in just being a rival to PayPal as a payment system? Or do you think he's got much bigger ambitions to turn X Financial into something much more like a bank?
I think he does, but
and then comes the question, who is going to regulate this?
Musk himself. That's a joke, of course. I mean, that's having the kid in the candy store.
That really generates confidence.
Although at the moment, there's no concrete evidence of this. I mean, X is still struggling for survival. It's still just a social media platform. So,
yes. Look, obviously, one can sound incredibly sort of pessimistic about this. I'm only talking about the potential. And I talk about it simply because at the moment, there is very little public attention on what is happening on the financial deregulation side. As I try to put in the globalist, the impact could be substantial. I'm not saying it will be, but it could be substantial. And at the same time, when you have this complete dismantling of the FCPA, of other fraud investigations, the getting rid of inspectors general, the whole dismantling of the government's apparatus to check for accountability and transparency, then you have to worry about mounting financial risk in our system.
Let's come back, Frank, to crypto. When does crypto become dangerous? If it becomes a rival to the dollar, at what point do we start worrying that a crypto crisis could be a broader financial crisis?
I don't worry about that, actually. I worry about the conflicts of interest, the fact that Trump and his children and cronies are all going to make lots of money out of the government by deregulating crypto. I think crypto will remain for a very long time a pure sideshow. But a considerable worry that I do have on that front relates to money laundering. As you know, I spend a lot of my time in trying to
Your Enablers is an important book.
Trying to promote anti-corruption. Well, if you've got a Justice Department that's just said it's not going to continue for the time being, at least, putting resources into investigating many financial crimes, and at the same time, you have a cryptocurrency system, crypto token system that will be free of a lot of regulation, and this is something that Trump has promised, and look at the people he's put in place to make sure that happens, then organized crime and kleptocrats around the world will totally be able to hide all of their ill-gotten gains and the way in which they invest them and transfer them from one country to another through the crypto system. I think that's worrying in and of itself, even if it doesn't cause a global financial meltdown.
And I wonder whether there's another dimension also to the fact that Trump is supposedly going to be meeting Putin in Saudi Arabia in the next week or two to talk about Ukraine. I mean, of course, there's such a thing as what one author called KGB style capitalism, the laundering, the mass laundering of mostly ill-gotten gain, illegal wealth. To what extent is Trump's eagerness to invite Putin back into the international system, to what extent does it have either a financial component or financial ramifications?
I think Putin and the oligarchs, Lukashenko in Belarus and his cronies, the former oligarchs of Ukraine who all made their money together with Russia, all of these people have been sanctioned since the start of the war in February 2022. And we're almost there at the third anniversary this coming week. Lift the sanctions, and I'm sure Putin really wants those sanctions lifted, and you restore, again, an increase in global money laundering, increase in financial crime, and increased opportunities for Putin and his cronies just to steal more and more money. And is that something that Trump would contemplate? Perhaps. The sanctions are leverage in a deal. And I think Putin very much wants all those financial sanctions and individual sanctions removed.
Do you think Trump can get away with that politically? You're in DC. If he does pull the sanctions options out of his pocket to establish what he would call a Ukrainian peace, which is really a peace imposed by America on Ukraine, or the Russians and the Americans, can he get away with it politically? Will mainstream Republicans accept that?
They seem to accept everything today. I'll leave it to some of your other guests to talk about the way in which Trump is manipulating all of the Republican members of the Senate and the House. I think he can get away with it. He seems to get away with an awful lot. And I'd like to return, if I may, just to something earlier. I really think there needs to be much more public attention on the dismantling of this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. To use a new verb in the
FPB.
To use a new verb in the vocabulary, it has been musked. Some people get mugged. The CFPB, like USAID, has been musked. And what is happening? This Musk and Trump and a few others have weaponized their authority to dismantle all of these kinds of institutions like the CFPB, and we're going to see it at the SEC, and we're going to see it at the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. And what's going to happen? Weaponize authority, you monetize power. This is where the conflict of interest comes in. And we have to be alert to that. And unfortunately, right now, we are not seeing the Congress alert at all to these sort of developments. I think that's very, very worrying.
In a broader international sense, I've always understood that American law is actually more aggressive than the UK, for example. Oliver Bullock, who's been on the show, wrote Butler to the World about the corrupt British system, which invites in dirty money from overseas, particularly Russia. But given that Trump now is demanding half of Ukrainian mineral resources, to what extent could this Trump revolution or counter revolution, whatever you want to call it, could it undermine America's role in the world as standing up to dirty money, not just within the US itself, but overseas?
It might undermine it, but there's no authority anywhere to replace it. The US Justice Department, to its enormous credit, did a fantastic job in recent years in really investigating kleptocracies and klepto-finance and for bribery of foreign government officials, not just by US companies, but by many, many companies around the world that happen to have some sort of US listing, like Airbus Industries, for example. There's no authority in Europe that is willing to take on that task. So we leave a vacuum. And who fills the vacuum? Kleptocrats, organized crime, and corrupt businesses. There was a headline last week in a paper in Nigeria that said Nigerian politicians are now open to American bribes. Around the world, we are being seen as permitting corruption. It is a terrible reputation for us to have. And as I said, you don't believe for one moment that the Swiss or the British are going to suddenly become super active in filling the roles that the US Justice Department has played in the past. They won't. All of this affects our financial stability.
Finally, Frank, as a Guardian headline today, Elon Musk's mass government cuts could make private companies millions. And they talk about defense and tech firms. We all know the famous photo from the inauguration of Zuckerberg and Bezos and the CEO of Google and, of course, Musk. But some people might say, well, what's wrong with that? This is the engine of the American economy. Tesla, SpaceX, Google, Facebook, Amazon. Why shouldn't the Trump administration focus on making big American companies even more profitable? Because that will make Americans more wealthier too.
There are two answers to this, I think. First, I agree with you. If standard public procurement accountability and transparency procedures are in place, then the companies that are going to win in competitive bidding for procurement should win. And if those happen to be the companies you just mentioned, good for them. If these are contracts, however, given without a bidding process, without transparency and accountability, then the public will lose. So I totally believe these companies have totally legitimate reasons to get government contracts. And if they can succeed in the standard bidding processes, good for them. The other side of this, though, is that Trump didn't embrace these particular people primarily for their business power. These people control media. Autocrats around the world, from Orban, and I would include Netanyahu and many others, one of the first things they do is ensure that they have the business tycoons who control media on their side. Trump is incredibly sensitive to having good publicity, and he has attracted these enormously powerful media tycoons. And if in their other businesses they get contracts legitimately, good for them. I worry about how their media power will be used to undermine our democracy and freedom of speech more generally. But on the basic issue, again, we come back to regulation. If the standard processes of accountability and transparency are in place, and procurement processes of competitive bidding are in place, let the best company win.
Well, what's the headline for today then in this conversation, Frank? Last time we had a conversation, we talked about whether Trump 2.0 will be a semi-legal repeat of the Sam Bankman-Fried FTX debacle. What's the worst that can happen in this new regime in Washington, D.C.?
That actions are taken, sometimes even inadvertently, that undermine the safety and soundness of our financial system. If that happens, everybody, not just here at home, but internationally, will suffer.
So we'll get 2008 again or 1930?
I hope we get neither, but we have to be acutely aware of the risks, and we have to call out all of the deregulatory measures if we believe that they are going to risk our system, that they are prompted by corruption and greed and not by the public interest.
Well, Frank Vogl, I hope you're wrong, but I suspect you may well be right. This will not be the last time you appear on this show. There's going to be a lot of twists and turns and dramas in certainly the financial history of the Trump regime. Thank you so much, Frank, and keep watching in DC. We need eyes like yours and ears like yours to make sense of what's happening. Thank you so much.